Mitchell Gomez, I am so honored to have you on. I saw you speak at Meetdelic and I just had to connect with you. It was such an honor that we were able to have you on. You're so passionate and articulate, and I'm so excited for my guests to be introduced to
Oh,
you.
thank you.
Can you let us know a little bit about who you are and the work that you do?
Yeah. So Mitchell Gomez, I'm the executive director of DanceSafe. Also involved in a couple other sort of psychedelic spaces. Harm reduction consultant for MAPS, so I help with their like harm reduction trainings and some Zendo stuff. What else do? I do a bunch of other things. I don't know. I do a lot of things, but most of my sort of time and energy goes towards DanceSafe. We do a lot of different services, but providing on-site harm reduction services at events, and also sort of figuring out how to best propagandize against the drug war is sort of my big picture place within the drug policy movement. Is how I would frame it, I guess.
Well, I'm so happy to have you on, and I do want to hit on all the things like legalities and what harm reduction is. But can you tell me a little bit about DanceSafe first and how they got started?
So I'm the executive director, but I'm not the founder of DanceSafe. I was 17 when DanceSafe started, so I was one of the people in need of their services, not one of the people providing their services. So Eman, who started DanceSafe, who's still involved, he still does some consulting for us. He had so in the very, very early years, he had tried MDMA when it was legal. So there was groups in Texas that would basically send out, MDMA was being distributed basically on a Tupperware model. So you would like get all your friends together, you would all try MDMA together, and then you put it in the order and send the order sheet off to Texas with your money order. And they would like mail you back these like large, I think they were like 130, 140 milligram wafers of MDMA. And this was legal. This was like a legal thing you could do in this country at the time. And so he had tried MDMA way back when it was available that way, and then had not been involved in the scene really at all for quite a long time. And then in the 90s, he went to a few events and he saw people taking what they were calling ecstasy, where clearly their behavior was not, they were not experiencing what he had experienced when MDMA was legal. And this really concerned him. So he started looking into like what was going on. He also realized that the general level of education within the electronic music scene was really, really terrible at the time. So like there was this really common belief that good ecstasy was a good combination of different drugs and bad ecstasy was a bad combination of different drugs. People didn't even realize they were looking for like a molecule called MDMA. People didn't know like what ecstasy was even supposed to be. And he found out that I believe it was Belgium or Germany, the government was providing drug checking services in nightclubs. So people in nightclubs could bring their pills to this table, and like public health professionals would test them using these little reagent tests. So he looked up the reagent tests and figured out that he could probably make these himself. It's quite dangerous if you don't know what you were doing. The early pictures of him mixing them on his kitchen table make my heart go pitter patter. You should not be doing this without like a fume hood and professional chemistry training, but he did. But really a big part of his plan was not so much to provide, he wasn't really trying to start this massive nonprofit. What he was really trying to do was duplicate what the needle exchanges had done. So the way that needle exchanges became legal in this country is people would give out needles, which was illegal at the time. They would get arrested for distributing drug paraphernalia. They would go in front of a jury. Juries would refuse to convict. That they would have to let them go. They'd go back out. They'd give out the needles again. They'd get arrested again. And eventually the police and district attorneys were the ones who sort of said, like, it doesn't make sense to have laws that we can't get convictions on that people clearly disagree with. It erodes people's confidence in the law as a system when you have people doing this on like a, very public way. And so that was his plan, is he was going to set up these booths, start doing drug checking, get arrested, have the fight in front of a jury, make the argument that this was a public health service and try to like legalize drug checking services the same way that needle exchanges had been legalized. That was in 1999. And in the 22 years since then, we have never had a volunteer testing patron employee. Nobody's ever been arrested doing this. And sometimes we do it quite openly. We've had signs at events that said, test your drugs here. I've really pushed the issue with some law enforcement who were, being kind of shitty and asking us to leave events, trying to get arrested. And we really can't do it. So clearly the police have learned their lesson. They recognize that when this is like a public health service, juries are not going to convict. And so we're in the very strange position of district attorneys and law enforcement are more concerned about arresting us than we are being arrested, which is a really strange power dynamic to be in with law enforcement, but it's where we're at. And yeah, so we have been, like I said, for 22 years, this organization has continued to grow. The year before COVID, we set up at quite literally hundreds of events. COVID obviously has put a huge damper on our ability to provide services at events. But it seems like we may be heading out of that one way or another. It seems like events are definitely starting back up again. And so, yeah, we set up at these events. We provide a whole host of harm reduction services. It's not just drug checking. Actually, in terms of like dollars spent, we spend, I think the year before COVID, we spent something like $30,000 on disposable earplugs that we give out at events. We give out hundreds of thousands of condoms at events. The other services actually take a lot more of the funding than the drug checking does, weirdly enough. We do a lot of stuff around sexual health, consent, power dynamics, all sorts of harm reduction services within the scene. But yeah, the drug checking is definitely like what gets us on the news. It's what gets the major media, which in some ways is unfortunate because we are a lot more than that. But that's sort of how it started.
That's incredible. And you had mentioned that this is something that you need when you needed when you were a teenager. What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of my personal motivation around harm reduction is that the reason I'm alive substantially is because of timing, right? So my period of really irresponsible drug use just happened to occur at a time when drug markets were not as bad as they are now. Maybe bad's not the term. Not as adulterated, not as misrepresented, not as I think dangerous is appropriate. Like the drug markets are just more dangerous now than they were in the late 90s. I started going to raves shortly after I turned 14. There were not a lot of 14-year-old, not a lot of people willing to sell substances to 14-year-olds. So like I would regularly find, baggies on the floor at raves and like take pills that way. Like that was just a regular part of my like early experience in the rave scene was just like, that was how I was able to find things because people were sketched out about selling MDMA to a little 14-year-old goth kid. And so, yeah, I was just lucky that, occasionally there were pills that were like mostly methamphetamine instead of MDMA. You're awake for a lot longer than you were intending to be awake for, but there wasn't this like, flood of the cathinones. There wasn't fentanyl showing up in everything. There wasn't, this sort of wide variation of dosages. We see pills coming out of Europe sometimes now that are like 300 milligrams of MDMA, where if you took 3 of those, like you're in problematic, like physiologically problematic dosage range now with the MDMA itself. And so, yeah, it was just a different drug market. And that's part of my motivation is that, I know that I'm lucky to have had that time period of drug use when the markets would allow for it without it being quite as dangerous. Whereas now, taking pills off the ground that you found at a party without testing them is a very, very different, risk profile for what could be in those substances.
So now you're definitely an advocate, but you seem to me that you were already a young advocate when you first started off before you aligned yourself with DanceSafe. Can you tell us a little bit about your advocacy work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe advocate is not the right term, but I've always been sort of deeply fascinated by human consciousness, how a few pounds of gelatin becomes aware that it's a few pounds of gelatin, about how, drugs work within the brain. I do think that drugs are still one of the best tools we have for examining how consciousness works. If you take a substance and it does a certain thing, and it does that reliably and repeatably, you can look at what it's doing in the brain and figure out like, this what's happening here has something to do with that subjective experience, right? So, if you really want to understand how sense of self and your awareness of the world around you is generated, like look at what happens when a person smokes salvia, right? Like we should be looking in people's brains when they're on salvinorin, because obviously your sense of self and how you interpret what you are is deeply disrupted by salvia, right? I mean, I've had, I've had the experience of being a circus tent, like, and I mean that quite literally, like I was a circus tent, like in salvia space. And then when I came out of it, I realized that like the tent pole was actually the bong that I was like looking down, right? That was the tent pole. So like, if you want to look at how visual phenomenon are processed into sense of self and phenomenological reality, like we should be funding salvia research really heavily in this country, and yet we aren't. And so, yeah, this is just a subject that's always fascinated me long before I could get my hands on drugs. I was deeply fascinated by the idea of drugs. I was, voraciously consuming, every book I could find about them. This was pre-Aeroid, so I was on blue light all the time and Usenet and like, really the early dark days of the internet when drug misrepresentation online or drug misinformation online was even worse than it is now. I mean, it was like some of the stuff I read was like very much not true. But yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, what this comes down to for me is that I just fundamentally believe that humans have a right to play with their own consciousness. I think that we have a right to control ourselves. And so I've always been very offended by the idea that the government has this like list of unapproved consciousness states, right? So like these are states of consciousness which you are not allowed to experience. And I think that when you frame the drug war as that, it becomes very clear to most people that this is like not an acceptable use of government power to control the different states of consciousness that we are allowed to access. But yeah, I mean, as soon as I found out about harm reduction, I want to say it was maybe 98, 99. So there was a group that used DanceSafe kits, but they were not actually a DanceSafe chapter. And they would set up at raves in Florida and do drug checking and give out free water. And yeah, immediately I recognized like, this is the way to deal with drug use. Right, there are intrinsic dangers to drug use. Even in a world where MDMA is legal, that doesn't mean MDMA would be safe. At certain doses, MDMA becomes very problematic. Even at recreational doses, serotonin forebrain axon damage does seem to actually be a real thing that happens. We don't understand why very well. There's a lot of sort of unanswered questions, but it does seem to be a thing. If you take MDMA and it's too hot out, or you're in a hot tub, or you're in a sauna, like your body loses its ability to thermoregulate. And so harm reduction is not just how we deal with the harms of prohibition, which is most of what I do, but it is also the model for how to deal with drug use in our society. It's how we can safely integrate substances within our society. And I genuinely believe that this goes for all substances. I think that, I always bring up, when I'm dealing with crowds that are involved in psychedelic spaces, I always use heroin as the example. When I'm dealing with like normies, I always use cocaine. For some reason, cocaine has a reputation as being far more dangerous among muggles than it does among psychedelic enthusiasts. But even drugs like heroin and cocaine, if you look at places like Switzerland, like Portugal, where they have really focused on harm reduction, the number of people dying from these substances are very, very, very low compared to countries like the United States, where, we treat this as a law enforcement issue, as a criminal justice issue, instead of a public health issue. And now, thankfully, we have people like Dr. Hart, who is out there speaking publicly about the fact that he uses heroin and does not meet any of the criteria for problematic substance use disorder, is not an addict in the old language. Everyone's trying to sort of move away from that language, but it's a term that a lot of people sort of have feelings about. He's a tenured Columbia neuroscientist with 2 best-selling books who uses heroin, right? And so there clearly are people who can use these substances, even the ones that have the reputations they have, in a way that is not detrimental to their lives, in a way that they derive benefits from. Some of my favorite books that Freud ever wrote, he wrote in like an absolute haze of injecting cocaine, right? He would inject cocaine like for days and days and days at a time. And there's really incredible books that he wrote like in a few days. It's say what you will about injected cocaine. It's not an ROA and a substance that don't have utility for some people. And so, the reason that he was able to do that is that he was not buying cocaine in unregulated markets, right? He was buying cocaine legally. He was getting it from doctors. He knew what it was. He knew the dosage. He knew the duration of the experience because he knew exactly what he was putting into his body. Going and buying cocaine on the street and IMing it is a very, very, very different risk than what Dr. Freud was able to do. but that's not a risk that's intrinsic to cocaine. That's a risk that's intrinsic to cocaine prohibition. And so by creating, what I think the ultimate goal should be for all harm reductionists is the creation of legal marketplaces, not just decriminalization. I think decriminalization in some ways is actually dangerous. I'm talking about full legalization of all substances so that people who want to use these things can use them, but particularly for the substances that have millennia of human use and deep religious significance, things like mushrooms, physiologically non-toxic, right? You literally can't fit a fatal dose of psilocybin in your stomach. Your stomach is not large enough to eat a fatal dose of mushrooms. I think that it's very clear that we've created just an absolute monster when it comes to outlawing substances like that, but really all substances. And I do try to push that message as much as possible. I actually have, real quick, I can show you guys one of my favorite things I own. So this is a roughly 3,500-year-old pre-Columbian piece. You can see he's holding a mushroom with one hand and shoving something in his face with the other. So this is from the Colima shaft tomb culture, where in this part of Mexico, people still use mushrooms religiously. And so, yeah, this thing predates the existence of the United States by about 15 times the age of our country, right? 3,500 years old.
Wow.
So 10 times would be 2,500 years old. It's 3,500. So yeah, 14, 15 times the age of our country. This little statue of this guy just facing mushrooms as hard as he can. So.
That's incredible. Okay, so on one hand, you have education and empowerment. That's part of your message. And then on the other hand, we have harm reduction, which is completely looking at the legal structure of our entire country. When we look at the legal structure of harm reduction, can you tell us a little bit about your message about childhood trauma?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really important thing to understand, is that when people think about unhealthy relationships with drugs, what a lot of people sort of frame as addiction, which is not a binary, right? It's not like there's recreational users and addicts, which is why people are trying to move away from that language of addiction, is that there's a spectrum of drug use. But when you talk about unhealthy relationships with drugs, people who use drugs compulsively, use them in really unhealthy ways, the number one predictor of that type of use is childhood trauma. It's not the drugs a person are using. It's not the way they're using them. By way, I mean ROA, right? Whether you're smoking it, snorting it, injecting it, like that's not a really good indicator of whether a person's relationship with a substance will become problematic or not. Really, the main predictor is trauma. People who develop unhealthy relationships with these substances are often dealing with their sort of own unresolved uncomfortableness or unhappiness within their lives. Poverty is another good indicator, right? And so it makes sense if you think about it. A person who is sort of well situated within their life, right? They're financially stable, they don't have a lot of childhood trauma, they're sort of generally psychologically healthy, is not going to have this sort of driving desire to like leave their baseline state of consciousness in a way that might become really unhealthy. They might enjoy getting high, they might enjoy leaving that baseline state, but they're not going to have this like compulsion where they sit sober and unaltered is so intrinsically uncomfortable to them that they develop these sort of patterns of like just getting out of that. And that was my experience as well. Like I've tried opiates and I was just tremendously unimpressed with them. Like the state of mind they induced was not something it was enjoyable, right? I mean, you're releasing dopamine, so like it felt good. But the fact that people develop those patterns where they just like want to, and I had friends who developed those patterns, right? I had friends who, I was dragging them out of Starbucks bathrooms after they nodded out on heroin. Like they really developed unhealthy relationships with those substances. And I didn't understand it until I learned this about childhood trauma, right? My parents are still happily married. I grew up in a very stable household. I grew up relatively financially secure, particularly once I was in a really formative age. When I was very, very young, my family was much worse off financially. But by the time I was like 10 or 11, our lives were very stable and, our finances were very stable. And all of my friends who developed those patterns were people who did not have that, right? Either their parents were divorced, or the parents had passed away, they had been passed around among relatives. Some of them had experienced really severe, childhood sexual trauma. And so when they tried opiates, and suddenly, I had one friend who described, when he tried heroin, he described it as the first time in his life he'd felt happy. Like that was how he described doing heroin. Like this was the first time I ever felt happy. And it was like, well, shit, like, of course you're going to keep going back over and over and over again, right? If this is the first time in your whole fucking life you ever felt happy. And so, yeah, you know, when you, sorry, allergies are killing me here. When you reframe the drug war as a war on victims of childhood trauma, which is quite literally what it is, because non-problematic users are far less likely to get arrested, right? Most people use drugs without ever interfacing with the criminal justice system because realistically there are so many people doing drugs and so few cops in this country that your statistical odds of, you know, running into cops are quite low. You know, but if you're somebody who's using in a very sort of compulsive way, you're somebody who's using in a chaotic way, which is the sort of language that a lot of people use now, your chances of being arrested are much higher. And so, yeah, that's really what the drug war is a war on people who need treatment, who need help, who need therapy, who need finances, you know, who need resources, not a war on drug users. I've often started calling it the war on some people who use some drugs. Like I'll put that in parentheses. I'm probably actually going to get that on a shirt at some point for DanceSafe. You know, I'll do that as like a fundraiser shirt. But yeah, I mean, that's what it is. It's a war on people who often suffer childhood trauma. Because prohibition and drug policy are not about the substances. They're more about who is using those substances, right? So the reason that heroin became demonized is that it was popular within jazz clubs and the jazz scene, where often white people and black people, that was the only place they were interacting as social equals. And so there was this massive law enforcement response from Anslinger, who was a deeply racist person, who would target, you know, these massive law enforcement raids against jazz musicians that he heard were using heroin. And yet when he found out Judy Garland was addicted to opiates, he paid for her to go through private treatment. The guy who was in charge of the drug war, just like it was a white famous person who was, you know, opioid dependent. So she got treatment, whereas black jazz musicians, they would kick down the doors of the jazz clubs and raid them with, you know, Tommy guns. And like, it wasn't about the drugs. It's never about the drugs. It's about who is perceived to be using those drugs. And I do genuinely think that's one of the reasons in the early years that DanceSafe was able to do what it did. I think it's still one of the reasons I'm able to do what I do. I had somebody, I was giving a speech at an event maybe 3 years ago at this point, where I was on the main stage at a music festival talking about drugs, right? I was talking about harm reduction. It was about an hour before the headliner was going to go on. And he had asked that I be given a half an hour on main stage to talk about harm reduction. And somebody in the audience during the question and answer pushed back against the idea of privilege. He said, you know, look, I've been arrested for LSD, like privilege doesn't exist, drugs are illegal. And I said, look, if you think that I could get on stage at a hip hop concert and talk about how to test your cocaine, and like I can see cops from where I'm sitting on main stage, right? Like there's cops right there, there's cops right there. Like if you think this is how it would go down in that community, if I was a little bit darker, you know, I'm not super white, but I'm white enough. Mm-hmm. The scene is white enough. Mm-hmm. Like, of course privilege exists. And we just have an obligation to leverage that privilege into ending the drug war for everyone. But yeah, no, I mean, alcohol does show that like there are intrinsic risks to substances. Those risks need to be modulated. But look, I can go buy a beer. I don't have to go buy whiskey, right? I can get the alcohol content that I want to drink socially. I can purchase it without risk of being blinded by methanol poisoning.
That's right.
You know, the gangs that are shooting up each other's communities are doing this because these drugs are illegal and they have no access to the legal resolution system that we provide for everyone else in this society, right? The last time one craft brewer shot up another was 1934. Wow. Right? There's a reason that hasn't happened since 1934. Wow. Because if a craft brewer has a problem with another craft brewer, they can take it to court, they can settle that shit in court, right? Like there's a system in place. And yet for cocaine sellers or MDMA sellers or even mushroom sellers, where, you know, we've started to hear rumors about organized crime getting involved in large scale mushroom cultivation. You know, there are no legal ways of dealing with disputes. So you deal with them in extra legal ways. You deal with them through direct violence or other sort of extra legal, you know, we see this in the Golden Triangle, right? Like in California, where these large scale, you know, unregulated pot grows, there's a long history of real violence in that area between different growers, between people trying to rob growers. And so, yeah, I don't think that, legalization will solve all of this, but it solves a lot of it. but one of the reasons so many people still die from alcohol, even under legalization, is that alcohol is a remarkably dangerous substance, right? Like in the grand scheme of like where different drugs sit in the risk to benefit, analysis. David Nutt is a UK professor who did a major study looking at like the social risks of drugs, the personal risks of drugs, the psychological risks of drugs, the perceived benefits of drugs. And alcohol was actually, I believe, further down the risk analysis than methamphetamine. Right, methamphetamine was higher up on the safety profile, and then he got fired. So he did this major study that showed that alcohol was what, and interestingly, mushrooms were safer than marijuana. I thought that was interesting too, that mushrooms were actually higher up on the safety scale than marijuana, which I had some questions about, but I never reached out. But yeah, the reason that alcohol is still such a dangerous drug, even though it's legal, is that it's a really dangerous drug. That's just intrinsic to that particular drug. I don't believe in any prohibition, but if we were going to prohibit substances, it would make far more sense to prohibit alcohol than methamphetamine. Like that's just like medically accurate to say that. And certainly something like LSD, which is physiologically non-toxic, right? There's no known fatal dose of LSD. Reports in the medical literature of somebody who accidentally snorted 7,000 hits of acid and lived. Like that's a report that exists in the medical literature. Like that happened. He stole a jar of white powder, thought it was cocaine, and snorted 0.7 of a gram of crystal LSD, which even for cocaine is a ridiculously high dose. I don't know what this person had some interesting decisions made for him to ingest 7,000 hits of acid.
There's a lot of misinformation and propaganda that's still afloat about a lot of this stuff, and it's really unfortunate because it just clouds the entire arena.
And is intrinsic to prohibition, right? So that is actually one of the things that prohibition needs in order to survive is misinformation, disinformation, and when you look at drug war spending, a large chunk of spending is spent on advertising. They spend a lot of money on propagandizing that drugs are dangerous. And when you look at studies on where they've done this education and drug use rates, it's clear that it does nothing, right? There's no statistically significant correlation between drug war education spending, which is what they call it, and drug use. None. So they can spend $1 billion in a county and it doesn't change the drug use rates in that county. And so for a long time, I thought that this was just them being stupid. I was like, oh, they don't know. I've actually come to believe it's different. I think they know that it doesn't affect drug use, but what it does is frame the conversation around drugs as one where the dangers of prohibition are actually framed as the dangers of drugs. And that's really important for them, right? So when people talk about like, oh, we have all these fentanyl deaths, we need more law enforcement. Like these fentanyl deaths are created by law enforcement. They're created by prohibition. They're created by border control. They're created by the system we have built. And I glibly describe this as you can't arrest your way out of a problem that you arrested your way into. Right? So if you increase border patrol, if you increase law enforcement, there are analogs that are 2 orders of magnitude stronger than fentanyl, right? So like carfentanil is much more powerful than fentanyl, but there's things like 4-fluorobutafentanil and other analogs out there where we're talking about hundreds of thousands of doses in a gram, and you cannot stop people from smuggling a gram of powder anywhere in the world. You can't do it. It's impossible. You can't do it in countries like Saudi Arabia and Dubai where they execute drug smugglers. You can't do it in countries like New Zealand where they take border enforcement more seriously, I think, than any other country in the world. So if you increase enforcement, if you increase law enforcement around fentanyl, people will switch to more potent analogs and the problem gets worse. Like that's it. Like that's just the reality of I can't remember his name now, but there's a guy who wrote a book and he coined the term the iron law of prohibition, which he described as the stronger the enforcement, the stronger the drugs.
Wow, that is so interesting.
And like, that's it. Like that's the iron law of prohibition. When you prohibit substances, people make them stronger to avoid law enforcement, to make smuggling easier. Like that's what prohibition does.
Wow, well, this has been the most educational, insightful conversation. I am so incredibly grateful. Can you give our listeners some insight into how they may change their own perception in their own life? And, we're doing such grassroots work right now, especially with the psychedelic renaissance. Can you give us some ideas on how we can be a better advocate in our community and just how we can be better humans in this world?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the two really, really big things is the first one is that everyone has to take responsibility for being the safest drug user they can be and for creating the safest drug using community that they can create, right? And so that means always testing substances before you take them. Like, you cannot get lazy about that. If you get lazy about that for one time and it's the wrong one time, like that can be the last mistake you make with how widespread fentanyl has become. Like, fentanyl adulterated cocaine is just like endemic now. We see it all the time. I know we don't even put out tested alerts anymore because it's just like that sort of, it's so endemic to what's happening right now. So like, you just have to know that if you're taking any substance that did not come to you from a medical professional, you have to test it. So even things that look like pressed pharmaceuticals, you don't know they're actually those pharmaceuticals unless you got them from a pharmacy. And so you just have to assume that there could be fentanyl there unless you personally tested it. But also doing all of the sort of harm reduction trainings that you can get your hands on, right? Like, I highly recommend everyone grab this guy from MAPS. They sell this for $20, which has to be under printing cost. It's like a massive fat book, but they want everyone to have this. It's the Manual of Psychedelic Support. You know, doing the DanceSafe training, doing the Zendo training. Anchors in Canada has a really good training program. So that as a community, if your friend is having a difficult psychedelic experience and you don't know how to deal with that, and you end up having to call for law enforcement or call, you know, some sort of social services provider, you've now drastically increased a lot of potential negative outcomes, from law enforcement, from a criminal conviction, to being sedated at a hospital while you're going through a psychedelic experience that maybe you could have integrated. And now you've been sedated and you didn't get the chance to do that. And that can cause really long-lasting problems. We see this all the time. I mean, I get emails all the time of people who were having a difficult psychedelic experience. They ended up at the hospital. The hospital shot them full of Haldol and strapped them to a backboard. And now they were like in a hallway at a hospital, tripping, but chemically restrained, like, while like all the things are going on in a hospital that are going on. I was in the hospital just 10 weeks ago. I got attacked by a dog, and like, it was traumatic sober. I mean, there was gunshot victims and a woman screaming that a COVID was fake and she refusing intubation. And like, I mean, it was a traumatic experience, very sober. You know, I was in pain, but I wasn't altered. And so like, yeah, being tripping and like, you know, as all this is going on, like, you've now created a lot worse outcomes for your friend, when realistically you probably could have handled it at home. If you've gone through the Zendo training, if you know how to deal with difficult psychedelic experiences, I lost count years ago of the number of people who, from the outside, were having what I would have always called a terrible trip, who in the morning said it was like the best night of their life because they were able to like process and integrate that experience.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Difficult does not mean bad. Difficult experiences can be really meaningful, really powerful, incredible agents of change. I do recommend you take like 72 hours before you actually pull triggers on any changes. But if 72 hours sober, you still feel like you need to quit your job and move to India and study yoga, you should quit your job and move to India and study yoga. Those revelations from psychedelics can be real and they can be really useful. But if you don't have the tools, you don't get the outcome, right? So having the tools as a community is really, really important. But another thing I think that is really important is to become politically involved. It is astonishing how much of politics really is just who shows up. I started getting involved with the Dem Party here in Colorado 5 years ago, you know, became a precinct committee person, where for my precinct, I'm like in charge of like calling people to get out the vote and doing all those things. And now I'm on the state Democrat platform, where we're rewriting the political platform for the Democratic Party for the state of Colorado. And I'm on the platform committee, right? Like, it took me a couple of years to get to that point where I get to be like, we should say that the official policy of the Democratic Party for the state of Colorado is ending the drug war. That should be an official, and I don't know if that's going to end up on the platform, right? But I get to talk to all the decision makers. My congressman and governor, like, I have their cell phone numbers and they answer my calls. Like, that is like and just from like showing up, like, you just have to get there and do, I have a meeting tonight, you know, like, but you just have to like show up and do the work. And if enough of us do that, we can really see a shift in this country from the sort of ratcheting to the right, which is a term that I recently became aware of. Basically, the Republicans move politics right, and the Democrats prevent you from moving back left. Right? No, we need to meet people in the middle, and the right moves right. No, we need to meet people in the middle, and the right moves right. And so that's why we've seen this shift in this country towards the right, is that we're constantly trying to meet people in the middle.
Oh, I see.
Right, like leftist policies, there is no leftist party in this country right now on the national level. Right. And like voting for the guy who wrote the RAVE Act was tough for me. I mean, that was a hard thing for me to do. Like Joe Biden has not been friendly to drugs. He is a drug warrior through and through. And yet the Biden administration is now going to be allowing, I think this is public now. It doesn't matter if it's not, it'll be public soon if it's not public now. They're going to be allowing federal funding to be used to purchase fentanyl test strips to give out for free.
Wow.
Right? So from the guy who said that rave promoters should be arrested, we have federal money going towards drug checking. Like, that is astonishing and doesn't happen without really heavy lobbying and people who believe in individual liberty, cognitive liberty, getting involved. And so, yeah, becoming politically involved. But if you don't have the time to do that, which I understand is time consuming, honestly, just being out and open as a drug user can be really impactful. Like, even just with your friends and family, you know, until we convince all the grandmas to end the drug war, we're not ending the drug war. And like, nothing will convince your grandma faster than you being like, no, like, I have a positive relationship with these substances. Right? Like, it's not, I'm not coming to you and saying like, I'm a drug user because I want you to pay for treatment. I'm telling you that like, this has been a good thing for my life. Like, these things are, humans have been using them for thousands of years. Like, they have been successfully integrated into some of the most important sort of religious, political, and philosophical movements in Western civilization, right? The Eleusinian Mysteries, which was sort of the birth of like the democratic system, was a psychedelic mystery cult in ancient Greece. Like, that's very, very clear. Like, we know they were a psychedelic mystery cult. I hate the term cult, but that's the anthropological term for these groups. And so just being honest that you're a drug user to those people around you, I think is really, really impactful. But the first one I gave is the most important. I really believe that.
Yeah, you know, being passionate and showing up like you have is just incredible, you know?
Yeah, but really creating the safe containers, I think, is just so important, because people do have a right to access psychedelics, but like, or any substances.
Safe
but like
containers with tools and education.
Right, the safe containers is just so important. Like, psychedelics can go sideways.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they can have really, you know, people who I've spoken to who have had years of psychological disturbances because of, you know, not properly integrating difficult psychedelic experiences, where like, you know, years of sleep disturbance and seeing counselors and like not being honest with their counselors that the initial trauma was a psychedelic trauma, because people think like, oh, it was just in my head, so it wasn't real trauma. It's like, no, trauma's trauma. Like, it doesn't matter. Interestingly, I actually know a therapist who they don't publicly do this. It's a sort of word of mouth thing, but they offer psychedelic integration psychotherapy and also deal with people who have experienced alien abductions. And I'm not saying alien abductions are real. I don't actually have an opinion on that. But the idea that like the overlap there is trauma that other people might not view as like real, and the fact that like it doesn't matter if it's real or not.
I was so thinking about this the other day. I absolutely love that you're bringing this up, because you're right. How do we deal with that trauma? You're absolutely right.
Right. It literally doesn't matter if it was in your head or outside. You've never experienced anything that wasn't in your head, right? Like, every thought, feeling, sight, sound, emotion, everything you've ever experienced was happening within your neural architecture. And so whether the trauma was an external, you know, consensus reality event or something that was purely internal to you is utterly irrelevant when it comes to how you address that trauma. Absolutely. It literally doesn't matter.
And that on the other side is that integration happens with every life experience, with my birth experience, with losing a loved one. So integration is this continuous, healthy experience of making meaning from our life and psychedelic experience.
Right.
So it's not real, exactly like you say.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually find the idea of like consensus reality and like how we describe these things, like this was real, this wasn't real because it was just in your head. Like, I don't think that's a particularly useful framing for experience. It's useful to know when you're talking to a person whether or not what they were saying was something that like was consensus reality or not, just because it can help you understand what they experienced. But in terms of like accepting that it was trauma, you know, accepting that it was like, or not even trauma, right? That it was an experience that was meaningful to them even, right? People
Right.
are often so embarrassed to share their psychedelic stories because it's like, oh, I had this like life-changing revelation, and then I realized the thing I was looking at was like a piece of toilet paper on the ground, right? So they feel so silly about it because like the external thing was so disconnected from the sort of revelatory, uplifting thing that was happening. And it's like, no, like it really doesn't matter. Like it really doesn't matter that the external stimuli was like something that was like silly or meaningless. And they'll even denigrate their own experience, right? Like they'll tell it as a funny story of like, oh, I had this experience of like talking to God and like I was actually just like licking a tree. And it's like, okay, well, trees are connected to the mycelial network, which is like basically a globally interconnected system of mushrooms under the ground. They're actually transporting nutrients and information between the different trees. Our DNA is giving off and receiving light at spectra that our eyes don't see. So it's possible our DNA is communicating with the DNA of the tree. Like, okay, so you were talking to a tree, like, even in the external reality sense, that could have actually been a real meaningful experience. And certainly from the standpoint of like, you should not treat these as meaningless stories. They're real. Those experiences are real in any sense that matters. And so, yeah, I think that just treating them that way is really important. I think it's, we just accept that the Nahua communities in Mexico, like the Aztec, Mixtec, Zapotec, they had this framing that the dream world was actually the real world, right? The things you experienced while you were dreaming were actually the consensus real, and that this was sort of more hallucinatory. And I only bring that up because I do think that explains their affinity for psychedelics in a really interesting way.
Yeah, that's true.
I
have a question because I really think this may be true for you. You care so much about this, and to you, it's on the political forefront of what matters. When people squabble about other things that they really think matter, and we can bring up anything from whether or not they want to wear a mask. Yeah. Are you the type of person that goes, listen, what I care about is the drug war? I don't care at all about this.
I'm not a single issue person in a lot of ways.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay. But I do think that I do actually have a single issue. The issue is the continual improvement of the human condition. I think that we should focus on building a better world, not accepting the world as it is. Right, so that's my single issue.
I love that single issue.
Yeah, that's my single issue.
Can you just say that one more time? Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of technology. I think that integrating technology into psychedelic spaces is going to be really important. I'm actually involved in a virtual reality psychedelic psychotherapy startup that's starting up soon.
I just saw that in Forbes, how they were talking about VR helping prepare psychedelic preparation.
Right, and also, during and integration, and there's a lot of different applications here. I also think that using technology to develop better drugs, right? So if we could find a theoretical MDMA analog, or even another, it doesn't even need to be an MDMA analog, but something that can give us the experience of MDMA, right? Which is a very unique, there are not a lot of drugs that do what MDMA does. If we could develop a drug that can do that without the serotonin axon damage, of course we should do it.
There was a
I'm not in love with MDMA as a molecule. I'm in love with the entheogenic state that it provides. And so, there's a lot of companies now that are developing these very sophisticated artificial intelligence models for predicting how drugs will interact in the human body. So we don't actually have to make the drug and do the study anymore. The AI is getting good enough that we should be able to, within maybe 10 years, predict that this arrangement of molecules will do this when we take it.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's a lot of what we will probably eventually describe as psychedelic states that we have never been able to access with drugs, right? So people who have injuries in certain parts of the brain develop full face aphasia. They can't recognize faces as faces. Damn, that would be interesting for 2 hours. It would be horrible as a condition, right? I would not want that as a permanent condition. But boy, if we could develop a drug that could do that for 2 hours, it would be so popular. That would be an absurdly popular drug just for the sheer novelty of knowing what that means. Because I literally don't know what that means.
But you're saying we could actually heal that condition as well.
And it gives us an insight, right, into how to heal that condition.
Which we would also be doing now with COVID, with the, parasynesthesia or something where they can't.
Right, the long haul COVID people who are experiencing things that a lot of people on drugs have experienced, where their sense of taste and smell is not muted, which is what a lot of people think it is, it's miscalculated. Like there's a miscalculation of their senses of smell and taste. There's people who are aphantasic. They have no internal imagery at all. They don't know what we're talking about when we say picture this. If we could develop a drug that could do that, we might be able to find a drug that could undo that for those people. And some of them wouldn't want to undo it. A lot of them actually think they derive benefit from their aphantasia. People who are aphantasic actually tend to have a much lower trauma response when they experience traumatic events. Wow. Probably because they literally can't relive it in the way that you and I can, right? Like we actually re-image the trauma over and over again. That dog that bit me 10 weeks ago, like I have seen him coming towards me in my head 1,000 times, like it sucks. Like I'd love to be able to mute that, and I have really vivid internal imagery. Like it's shitty. Whereas an aphantasic person would remember the incident as a list of like things that happened, right? Like this happened, I went to the hospital, they treated me, I came home. Like it's a list keeping thing, not an imagery. And look, even when I'm talking about list keeping, I am internally imaging, right? Like I can't even turn off my internal imagery when I'm talking about aphantasia. And so, yeah, I think that, creating a better human world, using technology to create a better world, I just think that it's not even so much that it's necessary to end the drug war to do that. It's that the reason we have to end the drug war is necessary to do that. Wow. Right? So what we need is a societal recognition of bodily and cognitive autonomy. Mm-hmm. That we as individuals own our individual minds and bodies. And that does not mean without any restriction. If you get in a car and drive drunk and you cause an accident, you have used your bodily autonomy to cause harm. Mm-hmm. And so I think that comes up, people often, I'm not a fan of vaccine mandates, but I do strongly encourage people to get vaccinated. I do believe in the efficacy of the vaccines. And I get a lot of pushback from people being like, you believe in all this bodily autonomy and you're saying that we should be really pushing these vaccines. And it's like, yeah, like you don't have the right to drive drunk, right? You don't have the right to like use your bodily autonomy to harm others. But until we develop that, we're not going to be able to build the society that I think we need to build in order for humanity to survive long-term, right? So like, things like climate change. Yeah. Things like climate change are ultimately about an empathy deficit, right? People don't have enough empathy for the people who will be impacted by climate change. They're like, oh, I have the money and resources to escape this. They're wrong. They do not have the money and resources to escape it. Literally nobody has the money and resources to escape it, but they believe that. Mm-hmm. And there are few things in the world that are better at generating empathy than MDMA. And so, using MDMA psychotherapy for not people who are diagnostically ill, but people who are simply lacking the empathy to build a civilization that can survive is really important. I strongly believe that we're going to need transhumanist technology integrated within our bodies. I actually have a long list of genes that I want to get ported into my body the minute that becomes available. There's a bunch of people in Italy who have this incredibly high-fat, unhealthy diet and have never had heart attacks, and like they know the gene complex responsible for it. They have like, give it to me now. I want to eat pasta every meal, but I can't do it. Like it would kill me. But yet I could just port these genes into my body. And often when I talk to people who are involved in transhumanist spaces, they talk about these technologies that they're going to develop and they're going to bring to market. And I'm like, they won't even let you smoke pot. Like the idea that the government is going to sit by while you're like upgrading your cortex is hot fucking nonsense. If we don't develop cognitive liberty as a civil right before those technologies come on hand, only the military is going to have them, and that is not okay. If everyone in the military suddenly gains 500 IQ points over a civilian, that is an absolute recipe for a permanent military dictatorship on this planet. Full stop. Not okay. And so that's my core thing, is that if we don't establish these things as rights now, I don't think we're quite in the last generation, but we're in that sort of bell curve of like a mass extinction event. And we just need drugs to get over that event. We need the creativity that psychedelics bring, right? The idea that psychedelics universally make you sort of move to the left politically is nonsense. There's a really great article called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis about actual self-described neo-Nazis who use LSD. There was a peer review academic journal written by the same author about the same phenomenon. I think that one's called The Integration of Psychedelic States by Right-Wing Movements or something like that. It's a different one. Brian Pace is the author, amazing guy. But what psychedelics do universally is increase human creativity. They are non-specific amplifiers of human creativity. And we need creative thinking. We need it from our engineers. We need it from our politicians. We need it from our doctors. We need it from our children. Like, we need more creativity in the world to solve the problems we are facing. They cannot be solved by uncreative solutions. And we have this incredible tool for universally increasing human creativity, and it's a felony to give it to people. Like, it is really a problem that we've created that dynamic. And I will tell one personal story. I think we're over the time you wanted to talk, but I will tell one more personal story, and then you can edit as you need to. I know somebody who works for a major defense contractor who had been working on a specific problem around a type of jet engine. And there were like teams of people who'd been working on this jet engine design for years and years and years. Years they've been trying to solve this problem. And at Burning Man, somebody offered him DMT. He had never done any drug. He'd never smoked pot. But he had read Strassman's book, and he was like, you know what? Like, this could cost me my job and my career if anyone finds out. I'm going to do it anyway. He couldn't turn the opportunity down. And came out of DMT space with the solution to this engineering problem. Like, went home, did the thing, got a massive 6-figure bonus, like solved this engineering problem, like in DMT space. And like, okay, military contractors solving military problems, maybe not exactly the most perfect use of psychedelics from my perspective as somebody who is philosophically anti-war. There's actually another precedent for this. When LSD was legal, there was a group of officers who used LSD to develop more creative bombing patterns in Vietnam. That's a public record that happened.
Wow.
But when it comes to solving the big engineering problems that we do need to solve, right, how we shift from a carbon climate to a non-carbon climate is probably going to be the largest engineering challenge humans have ever undertaken. Moving away from fossil fuels will be the biggest engineering problem we have ever taken on. And we are going to need the absolute smartest people being the most creative they could be. And like, we have a tool. We have a tool that can do that. And so, you know, how we integrate that tool into our society, I think, is the big question that we're facing. We're running short on time. You know, we these problems, realistically, we need to be sort of implementing solutions now, not developing solutions now. Mm-hmm. And so it's possible that we have missed the window, but I don't think we've quite missed it yet. I do think we still have the ability to fix these things. And so bringing every tool we have to the table, certainly bringing the best tool we have to the table. There is nothing that more universally and more reliably increases human creativity than psychedelics. That is just a factually true statement. And so not bringing the best tools we have to the big problems we're facing, I think might kill us as a species. Mm-hmm. And like, that's my motivation. Like, I'm trying to save humanity. I genuinely believe that humans are awesome. And like, I want us to survive. I want our species to survive. I want us to get off this rock. You know, Isaac Asimov joked once that the ultimate cause of dinosaur extinction was their lack of a space program. Mm-hmm. And like, it's funny, but it's also true. Like, that's what actually killed the dinosaurs, is that they were only on one planet. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's where I'm at. I just think that this is the thing we can do to increase our survival odds, you know, maybe get us off this rock, increase empathy among our civilization so that we recognize that, you know, all humans are one family. We are all descended from the same people. You know, what happens to one happens to all. And bringing that awareness to the people with the money and power, so that we can actually decrease their money and power, right? That's actually the dynamic that needs to happen, is convincing these people to walk away from their power, is going to be really, really, really hard. And so how we do that, I think, is by integrating these states into our civilization. And yeah, that's my sort of end goal, is saving humanity. It sounds so silly when you're like, I go to raves and test people's acid, and I just like, like, why are you doing this? Like, oh, I'm just trying to make sure that humans get to Mars. Like, that's like, that's my goal here. Like, I just want to save the planet. I want to end global warming. I want to make sure everybody has a home and enough food to eat. So like, that's why I go to festivals and test people's MDMA. Sounds so absurd framed that way, but it really is what I'm doing. So I guess I'll just say it.
Well, I mean, your passion and your enthusiasm is the most inspiring thing that
Oh,
I've come
thank you.
across
I
in so
appreciate
long.
that.
I wish I could be your roommate so that I could just take all your tidbits and research and create content from them.
Yeah, we tend to burn through roommates. I wonder if that's part of why,
Oh yeah.
actually.
How can people get more of you? Where can we follow you? Where are you sharing?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my stuff goes out through the DanceSafe socials. So first and foremost, you should follow all the DanceSafe socials. There is also a Mitchell Gomez page on Facebook. I have a page where I post occasionally, not just a profile. So if you just look for Mitchell Gomez, it's a picture of me. It's very easy to find. I don't tweet a lot. I need to get more active on Twitter. I don't TikTok a lot. I need to get more active on TikTok. But certainly doing the DanceSafe training, so you become a DanceSafe volunteer, and then you can come to events and work events with me where I get to do this for. I'm always hoarse by Friday. It's amazing. Like by Saturday, I'm like writing notes and whispering. But yeah, if you want more of me, that's the best way to do it. Is become a DanceSafe volunteer, and we do retreats occasionally. We haven't done it in a while, but we're gonna hopefully do another DanceSafe, chapter officer retreat, maybe 2022 when COVID has become endemic instead of a pandemic, and it's just we've moved on with our lives in this country despite the fact that people are still dying, which seems to be the direction that things are heading, and I don't see any solution to that does not require political power I simply don't have. But yeah, that's sort of the best way to do it, is to follow DanceSafe socials, do the DanceSafe training.
Okay.
There's a fun talk on this. Do you know what Ignite talks are? So they're like 5-minute TED Talks. So the motto of Ignite is inspire us, but make it quick. And so I did an Ignite at Boulder a couple years ago. If you search Mitchell Gomez Ignite on YouTube, it's on there. It's quite good. It's also worth listening to the talk directly before me, which was Peter Young, who is a convicted eco-terrorist in like a floral print shirt. The dude's amazing. Like he's like this like nerdy, like horn-rimmed glasses convicted terrorist. And his talk was amazing and about how to survive prison, which is another useful skill set if you're currently involved in these spaces.
Oh my God, this has been just incredible. Thank you so much, Mitchell.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me on. It was great talking to you.